Only in Kentucky can a single county claim the birthplace of the 16th President of the United States, and also a rustic tourist motel that the federal government literally tried to hide by planting a giant wall of trees. Hi, I'm Michael, and I'm learning a little bit more about Kentucky, one county at a time, all 120 of them. And today, I'm learning about LaRue County. Located just outside the traditional bluegrass region, LaRue is an area defined by low rolling hills, dense eastern woodlands, and a steady winding path of the Nolin River. Following the American Revolutionary War, a massive wave of tough, ambitious pioneers began spilling over from mountains from Virginia and Pennsylvania, looking to carve out a new life in the West. In 1780, a surveyor named Philip Phillips led a company of settlers into this valley and constructed a heavily fortified settlement known as Phillips Fort. This timber stockade was an absolute necessity for survival. It served as a place of refuge, protecting the early families from the intense, violent raids that defined the Kentucky frontier. Once the area became safer, the settlers began moving out of the fort to establish their own isolated farms. One of those early pioneers was a man named Robert Hodgen. In 1789, he purchased a massive 10,000-acre tract of land and built a gristmill right on the banks of the Nolin River. That mill became the beating economic heart of the valley. Farmers traveled for miles around to grind their grain, and a small community naturally began to sprout up around the water wheel. Following his death, his widow and children petitioned the local courts to establish a formal town on their land. In 1818, the settlement was officially recognized, and they named it Hodgenville in his honor. During those early foundational years, a young carpenter and farmer named Thomas Lincoln was trying to make a living in the harsh Kentucky wilderness. In the late fall of 1808, Thomas and his wife Nancy settled on a tract of land just a few miles south of Hodgenville called Sinking Spring Farm. It was a rugged, heavily fortified, wooded piece of property named for a deep natural spring that dropped away into a cave in the earth. It was on this exact farm, in the freezing dead of winter in February of 1809, that Nancy Lincoln gave birth to a baby boy inside a tiny, crude, one-room log cabin with a dirt floor. They named him Abraham. The early childhood of Abraham Lincoln was entirely shaped by the rough, unforgiving environment of LaRue County. When he was just 2 years old, a dispute over land titles forced the family to move a few miles northeast to another plot of land called Knob Creek Farm. This new farm sat right alongside the old Cumberland Trail. It was here that young Abraham spent his formative years, fetching water, carrying firewood, watching the endless stream of pioneers, peddlers, and enslaved people being marched down the dirt road. It was also at Knob Creek that American history was almost completely rewritten. One day, while playing near the swollen, rushing waters of the creek, young Abraham slipped and fell into the deep water. He couldn't swim and he began to drown. A neighbor boy and close friend named Austin Gulliher saw him struggling, grabbed a long tree branch, and extended it out into the raging water. Abraham grabbed the branch, and Austin pulled him to safety. If it wasn't for the quick thinking of a Kentucky farm boy, the 16th President of the United States would have died before his 8th birthday. In December of 1816, facing ongoing legal battles over their Kentucky land titles, Thomas Lincoln packed up his family and moved them north into the deep forests of Indiana. While the Lincolns were struggling to farm the land, other residents in the area were finding wealth in a completely different industry. LaRue County actually has incredibly deep, legendary roots in the history of American whiskey. A local man named Waddy Boone, who happened to be a distant relative of the famous explorer Daniel Boone, built one of the very first distilleries in the region near Knob Creek. In fact, historians widely consider him to be one of the very first documented people to produce bourbon in Kentucky, all the way back to 1776. According to local folklore, Thomas Lincoln even accepted a temporary job working at the Boone Distillery in 1814. This distilling heritage exploded after the Civil War. In 1866, a man named John McDougal Atherton built a massive distilling operation on the rolling fork of the river, and the facility was incredibly successful. Within 10 years, the distillery employed over 200 men, making it the absolute largest employer in the entire county. A booming town grew up rapidly around the warehouses and the mash tubs. They built a general store, a bustling hotel, churches, and a school, and they eventually named the town Athertonville. The Athertonville operation produced thousands of barrels of high-quality whiskey, eventually being bought out by the Seagram Company. But the golden era of LaRue County distilling came to a terrifying end on a freezing night in February of 1972. A massive fire broke out in the still house at 3 in the morning. Volunteer fire crews battled the blazing inferno for over 4 hours, desperately trying to keep the flames from spreading to the massive rick houses where the highly flammable whiskey was aging. They managed to contain the fire, but the core of the distillery was completely gutted. The facility never recovered, putting dozens of people out of work and bringing the great distilling era of Athertonville to a quiet end. Long before that fire, the people living in this region had decided they needed their own local government. By the early 1840s, the residents of the Nolan River Valley were growing incredibly tired of traveling the long, difficult distance to the county seat in Elizabethtown. They demanded their own county. On March 4th, 1843, the Kentucky legislature officially carved a brand new county seat out of the southeastern portion of Hardin County. But picking a name turned into a fiercely political debate. Many residents wanted to name the county Lynn. Others proposed naming it Helm in honor of a prominent local politician who would later become the governor of Kentucky. Still, others pushed for the name Slaughter. Finally, a compromise was reached. They agreed to name it LaRue County, honoring John P. LaRue, one of the original pioneer settlers who had helped establish the region back in the days of the frontier forts. Hodgenville was officially crowned the county seat, and a brick courthouse was soon constructed in the center of town. Less than 20 years later, the brutal reality of the American Civil War arrived in LaRue County. Kentucky was a bitterly divided border state, and massive armies from both sides constantly moved through the region. In the winter of 1861, the Union Army established a massive drilling and observation post called Camp Wickliffe just south of the community of White City. But the county was also plagued by chaotic, violent bands of guerrilla fighters. In February of 1865, deep into the final months of the war, a group of Confederate guerrillas rode into the heart of downtown Hodgenville. The county courthouse was currently being used as a temporary barracks for Union soldiers. The guerrillas attacked the building and set it completely on fire. As the flames consumed the courthouse, the brave citizens of Hodgenville desperately rushed in and managed to save every single official county record before the roof caved in, preserving their history from total destruction. Riley, you want to come in? As the 19th century came to a close, the nation began to look back at the origins of its greatest leaders. People realized that the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln was just sitting quietly as a working farm in the hills of LaRue County. The original log cabin where he was born had reportedly been dismantled years earlier, its logs repurposed and sold off. Well, a wealthy New York businessman named Alfred Dennett eventually purchased the Sinking Spring Farm. He tracked down what he believed were the original Lincoln cabin logs, bought them, and rebuilt the crude structure. But Dennett was a showman. He quickly dismantled the cabin again and began shipping the logs all over the country to display them at various world fairs and exhibitions. In a bizarre twist of history, the logs of the Lincoln cabin were temporarily stored in the exact same facility as the dismantled cabin logs belonging to the birthplace of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Eventually, a group called the Lincoln Farm Association purchased the farm and tracked down the logs, determined to build a permanent, dignified memorial. But when they brought the logs back to Kentucky and began to reassemble the cabin, they realized the logs had been hopelessly mixed up during their travels. No one knew for sure which logs belonged to Lincoln and which belonged to Davis. They ultimately constructed a symbolic cabin that represented the size and the style of the original. To protect the symbolic cabin, the association commissioned the renowned architect John Russell Pope to design a breathtaking neoclassical temple right on the site of the Sinking Spring Farm. In 1909, on the exact centennial of Lincoln's birth, President Roosevelt traveled to LaRue County to lay the cornerstone. 2 years later, President William Taft actually arrived to dedicate the magnificent stone building himself. The architecture of the memorial is incredibly deliberate. The massive marble building features exactly 16 windows, 16 intricate rosettes carved into the ceiling, and 16 fence poles, all symbolizing Lincoln's status as the 16th president. Leading up the hill to the grand entrance is a massive stone staircase with exactly 56 steps, representing the age Lincoln was when he was tragically assassinated in Washington. Today, the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Park draws hundreds of thousands of visitors from across the globe who come to stand in the quiet Kentucky woods where the great emancipator took his very first breath. The sudden influx of early 20th century tourism created a fascinating, slightly chaotic business boom in LaRue County. As newly paved roads made automobile travel possible in the 1920s, local entrepreneurs realized that there was money to be made off the tourists flocking to the memorial. Well, in 1928, a local man named James Howe built a beautiful rustic building out of an unhewn chestnut and red heart pine logs directly adjacent to the national park property. He called it the Nancy Lincoln Inn. He rented out small, primitive overnight cabins to tourists and served hot meals to travelers. But the federal government was pretty upset about this. The National Park Service felt the privately owned inn was a tacky, unacceptable commercialization sitting right next to their sacred marble temple. The government actually went out and planted a thick wall of red cedar trees specifically to block the view of the inn from the memorial grounds. Well, despite the efforts and the fierce rivalry, the Nancy Lincoln Inn survived. Today, it remains privately owned by the exact same family and is officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places, serving as a fascinating monument to the wild and early days of American highway tourism. Beyond the massive shadow of Abraham Lincoln, LaRue County has produced other incredible history-making figures. In the small unincorporated community of Tonyville, a young man named Carl Brashear was born into a family of sharecroppers in 1931. Seeking a better life, Brashear joined the United States Navy shortly after it was officially desegregated. While facing intense systematic racism and prejudice, he refused to back down. He pushed his way into the elite, highly dangerous Navy diving program. In 1966, during a horrific accident on a salvage mission, a heavy towing line snapped and severely mangled Brashear's left leg, forcing doctors to amputate it below the knee. Instead of accepting medical retirement, Brashear engaged in a grueling, unprecedented physical rehabilitation program, and he secretly trained himself to dive using a prosthetic leg. He proved to the military brass that he was still capable of extreme physical labor. And in 1970, Carl Brashear made history by becoming the very first African American to be promoted to the elite rank of Master Diver in the United States Navy. He and his story were later immortalized in the film Men of Honor. Today, the culture of LaRue County is a beautiful blend of deep agricultural roots and proud historical preservation. The county is dotted with small, tightly knit communities like Buffalo, Magnolia, and Upton. The economy relies heavily on the steady hum of public services, the local school system, and light manufacturing like the Nationwide Uniform Corporation facility right there in Hodgenville. Every single October, the streets of Hodgenville completely shut down for the annual Lincoln Day celebration. It's an incredible, authentic small-town festival featuring rail-splitting competitions, pioneer demonstrations, live bluegrass music, and a famous Abraham Lincoln lookalike contest. The county has seen a slow, steady, and stable population growth, hovering right around 15,000 residents today. So, that's LaRue County. What'd I get wrong this time?